Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission here is, well, to distill complex topics, bring you the key facts, and hopefully give you a really clear picture so you can get informed quickly. Today, we're tackling a huge one, the Edward Snowden revelations, mass surveillance. We're going to dive deep into the source material, especially Glenn Greenwald's book, to really unpack this surveillance system, what it means for, well, all of us, and the incredible challenges faced by the people who brought this story out.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, while Snowden really blew the lid off things, the underlying issues, they've been bubbling under the surface for years, hidden mostly. Technology now allows for this ubiquitous surveillance that used to be just sci-fi stuff. And you throw in the post-9/11 climate, that focus on security above all else, it really created the perfect storm for potential abuses.
Right. So let's start there. Why Glenn Greenwald? Why did Snowden pick him specifically?
The sources say Greenwald had this history right, covering the NSA warrantless wiretapping back from 2004. Snowden thought he'd get the dangers, understand the secrecy issue, and crucially, that he wouldn't back down when the pressure inevitably came.
And that ties into a much older fight, doesn't it? This idea of resisting government intrusion. Think about the American colonists protesting those general warrants from the British, searching anywhere, anytime. They wanted specific targeted warrants, probable cause. It's the same principle, just different technology now. Electronic versus physical search. Snowden's first contact was, well, pretty cloak and dagger. An email from Cincinnatus telling Greenwald to use PGP encryption. Pretty good privacy. Invented back in '91, our sources say it uses code so complex that even major spy agencies would need years, literally years, to crack them. That tells you something right away. But Greenwald, he kind of dragged his feet initially on installing the software, even after Snowden sent him nudges, a video guide. PGP for journalists.
It was this sort of catch-22, wasn't it? Snowden couldn't say what he had without encryption.
And Greenwald didn't feel the urgency without knowing how big the story was.
Ooh.
Exactly. And this is where Laura Poitras, the filmmaker, becomes absolutely vital. She was already making a film about NSA surveillance, and she'd faced serious harassment herself. Detained, over 36 times at airports, stuff seized. Greenwald wrote an article about her harassment, and interestingly, it actually stopped it for a while, which taught them a really powerful lesson. As the book puts it, national security officials do not like the light. They act abusively when they think they're in the dark. Secrecy is the key, the linchpin of abuse. And transparency. That's the only real antidote. So Greenwald finally gets the documents, 2 USB drives FedExed, instructions included, and the first files he opens. Just immediate shock. An NSA training manual, and then this PowerPoint. Prismus 984 XN overview. And right there, boom, logos of 9 huge internet companies. Google, Facebook, Apple, indicating direct server access.
Yeah, and the classification markings hammered at home. Top secret, commit no foreign. Highly classified signals intelligence, not for foreign eyes. This wasn't minor stuff. This was the crown jewels.
And apparently Snowden had organized it all incredibly well, just countless folders, everything precisely placed, which, contrasts with some criticisms leveled against Chelsea Manning about organization.
Right, and one folder stood out. Boundless informant. NSA lied to Congress.
Yeah.
Full of documents, stats, showing the NSA was grabbing data on millions of Americans every single day, directly contradicting what officials like NSA Chief Keith Alexander had told Congress. They'd claimed they couldn't even get those numbers.
So what drove Snowden personally? He was trained as a top cyber operative, CIA, NSA. But he started seeing that what his government was actually doing. It was very different from what he'd been taught. He saw the internet as this place for freedom, exploration, understanding, and turning it into a giant surveillance machine. He felt that just gutted its core potential, destroyed what made it special, and he knew the price. He was giving up everything people value, right? Girlfriend, Hawaii, stable career, big paycheck. He was on track for like $200,000 a year, but he saw the state and tech industry working hand in glove to access everyone's communications.
It really makes you pause. What makes someone do that? He seemed strangely calm about the consequences, prison even. He just said, the only thing I can't live with is knowing I did nothing. And deciding to identify himself early on, that was strategic. Define himself before the government could paint him as something else. Keep the focus on the information.
Okay, so we've seen how it started. Now let's dig into the machine itself. The surveillance apparatus he exposed, the scale is just hard to comprehend. NSA Director Keith Alexander's motto says it all: collect it all. They first tried this in Iraq, apparently, hoovering up all communications data from the entire population, and then they thought, hey, let's apply this to Americans. Chilling.
And the documents give us numbers. hard numbers. In just one 30-day period, one unit collected data on over 97 billion emails and 124 billion phone calls, globally and domestically. In another 30-day window ending Feb 2013, one unit grabbed over 3 billion pieces of communication data just from U.S. systems.
3 billion. And even before Snowden, reports mention the NSA intercepting and storing 1.7 billion emails, calls, other comms from Americans every day.
A huge part of how they do this is through partnerships. Countless overlapping deals with private companies. Get this, some 60,000 employees of private corporations work on core NSA functions. The lines are incredibly blurred.
These partnerships were run by this super secret unit, Special Sources Operations, SSO. Snowden called it the crown jewel. They managed programs like Blarney that relied on a long partnership with AT&T, targeting countries like Brazil, France, Germany, Israel, Japan, Mexico, even the EU and UN. Then Fairview, collecting massive data globally, especially phone calls, maybe 200 million records a day. And Stormbrew, working closely with the FBI, tapping internet and phone traffic at critical choke points inside the U.S., involved 2 major U.S. telecoms and submarine cable sites. It's a web.
And that brings us to PRISM, probably the most famous one. That's the program letting the NSA pull data directly from the servers of those big 9 internet companies, Facebook, Yahoo, Apple, Google.
And the companies pushed back initially, right? Some denied direct access. Yahoo actually fought the NSA in court, trying not to join PRISM. But then you had Microsoft, according to the documents, making vigorous efforts to give the NSA access to SkyDrive, Skype, Outlook, even helping the NSA bypass the very encryption Microsoft was telling the public was vital for privacy. That's quite something.
And it wasn't just capping pipes. There's computer network exploitation, CNE. The NSA's TAO division, Tailored Access Operations, basically their own hacker unit. They infected at least 50,000 computers with malware called quantum insertion. The New York Times later said it was closer to 100,000 computers worldwide. And incredibly, they could apparently even infect computers not connected to the internet.
Wow. And this reach goes global through alliances like the Five Eyes, US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The US paid the UK's GCHQ, their equivalent, at least $100 million, to help the NSA's goals. Canada's agency targeted Brazil's Ministry of Mines and Energy, and Australia actually asked the NSA to surveil Australian citizens more. They pleaded to extend the partnership.
And then there's the sharing with Israel. Routinely sharing raw intelligence containing American communications, often without the required minimization. The steps meant to protect U.S. persons' data that gets swept up accidentally.
The hypocrisy here is just stark. The U.S. government warns everyone about Chinese routers having backdoors for spying, yet the NSA itself intercepts routers and servers being exported from the U.S., implants its own backdoor surveillance tools, and then sends them on.
Which leads us to X-Keyscore.
Yeah.
Described as the NSA's widest-reaching system. It basically vacuums up nearly everything a typical person does online. Emails, browsing, chats, in real time. And the most shocking part, any NSA analyst could apparently search these massive databases. With no real oversight, just fill out a simple form to justify it. This backs up Snowden's most audacious claim.
The one where he said, I, sitting at my desk, could wiretap anyone from you or your accountant to a federal judge or even the president if I had a personal email. X-Keyscore was how. Okay, so that's the how. Let's talk about the so what. The cost of all the surveillance. We've all heard the nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument, right? Often from tech leaders. Google's Eric Schmidt said, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it. Zuckerberg claimed privacy wasn't a social norm anymore.
Yeah, the irony is pretty thick there. The government itself operates under intense secrecy. And Zuckerberg, well, he bought the 4 houses next to his own for $30 million just to ensure his privacy. Yeah. It really underscores that the desire for privacy isn't some luxury. It's fundamental. It's, as Justice Brandeis said, part of the right to be left alone, essential to being human.
And the sources make a crucial point. People act differently when they know they're being watched, radically differently. It leads to self-censorship, a chilling effect on freedom. There's this anecdote about a rabbi telling a girl at her bat mitzvah she's always being watched and judged. The implication being, if you think you're always watched, you're never truly free.
It absolutely echoes Orwell's 1984. The scary part wasn't constant watching, necessarily. It was the uncertainty, the possibility that you could be watched at any moment. That's what kept people in line. Orwell described the telescreen. You had to live in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard and every movement scrutinized. That constant possibility.
And officials tried to downplay it. President Obama said the NSA is not listening to Americans' phone calls. But the 2008 FISA law allows incidental collection of Americans' communications if they talk to a foreign target. They call it incidental, but it happens.
And the oversight mechanisms seem, well, weak. The FISA court, it approves almost everything. In 2012, it approved every single one of the 1,788 requests it got. Every single one.
All right.
And the Congressional Intelligence Committees. Our sources describe them as even more compliant than the court, basically just defending whatever the agencies do.
Then there's the metadata argument. It's just metadata, not content. But metadata can be more revealing, can't it? It paints this incredibly detailed picture of your life. Who you talk to, when, for how long, where you are. Professor Edward Felton's example is powerful. Call a gynecologist, then your mom, then a man, then Planned Parenthood. The metadata tells a pretty clear story, even without hearing the words.
Exactly. Metadata is mathematical, clean, easy to analyze. It reveals patterns, associations, incredibly intrusive. And this capability wasn't just for counterterrorism. There's clear evidence of economic espionage, targeting Brazil's oil company Petrobras, economic conferences in Latin America. Programs like Blarney even listed economic targets. This flies in the face of U.S. officials condemning China for doing the exact same thing.
And diplomatic spying, too. Targeting leaders like Brazil's Dilma Rousseff, Mexico's Peña Nieto, spying extensively on the UN to get a diplomatic edge, like getting the Secretary General's talking points before meetings.
Which brings us to the main justification. Fighting terrorism. Is mass surveillance actually effective? The evidence presented in the sources strongly suggests no. It's a sham, as Greenwald puts it. A federal judge called the metadata program likely unconstitutional and said the government couldn't show one single instance where it stopped an imminent attack.
Even President Obama's own review panel found the metadata program was not essential for preventing attacks. What actually worked was traditional policing, targeted intelligence, tips, not bulk collection. In fact, the argument is made that mass surveillance makes stopping terror harder. It swamps the system with too much data, finding the needle in an ever-growing haystack.
And that challenges the whole safety versus liberty trade-off, doesn't it? The idea that civil liberties don't matter if you're dead.
No.
But the Constitution itself accepts a risk of more crime by forbidding suspicionless searches, because keeping the state out of our private lives was seen as a fundamental value, worth protecting even at some risk.
So, this massive story breaks. What about the media's role? The so-called Fourth Estate. Greenwald faced immediate hostility, which our source suggests was inevitable. The New York Times did an early profile that he felt tried to frame him as just a blogger or activist, not a journalist. Why does that matter? Well, it makes it easier for the government to try and criminalize the reporting. They even asked about his debts, taxes, some old business partnership, trying to discredit him personally.
Exactly. If you're not a real journalist, maybe you don't get journalistic protections. And calling him an activist suggests he's part of the plot, not just reporting on it. We saw this playbook with James Rosen at Fox News labeled a co-conspirator by the DOJ just for doing standard reporting.
And the calls for Greenwald's prosecution were loud and public. Congressman Peter King accused him of violating espionage laws. Alan Dershowitz said he'd clearly committed a felony. General Michael Hayden, former NSA chief, said Greenwald was more deserving of being called a co-conspirator than Rosen ever was. David Gregory on Meet the Press kept questioning his journalist status, asking about his role. Andrew Ross Sorkin at the NYT straight up said he should be arrested.
It's a classic tactic.
Yeah.
Demonize the messenger.
Yeah.
Daniel Ellsberg, Assange, Manning. Paint them as weirdos, loners, traitors. It distracts from the message and scares off others. The unspoken assumption is that obedience to power is normal, but dissent must stem from some personal flaw or ideology.
And you see this double standard, right? Powerful officials leak classified info all the time to reporters like Bob Woodward when it suits them. The Obama administration leaked details about drone strikes to the Times, but leaks that embarrass the government? Suddenly, that's a crime.
Which makes you question this whole idea of journalistic objectivity. Greenwald calls it an obvious pretense. He argues that this bland, opinionless corporate journalism ends up being harmless to power. It doesn't challenge anyone. Exactly what those in power want.
And there are examples of the media playing ball. The New York Times held James Risen's NSA wiretapping story for over a year at the White House's request. The LA Times killed a story about AT&T helping the NSA after the Director of National Intelligence asked them to.
Plus, you have this constant revolving door. Journalists become government spokespeople. Former government officials become paid commentators on news channels. Jay Carney, David Axelrod. It creates this cozy relationship, this identification with the system they're supposed to be holding accountable. They become defenders of it.
And things got really serious. The UK government actually demanded the Guardian newspaper destroy hard drives containing Snowden's files, physically destroy them. And then the pressure became intensely personal for Greenwald. His partner, David Miranda, was detained at Heathrow Airport for 9 hours, held under the Terrorism Act just for transiting through London, forced to give up passwords to his phone, his laptop, under threat of arrest.
The message was crystal clear. A U.S. official admitted to Reuters that detaining Miranda was partly intended to intimidate The Guardian and others, to show the UK government was serious about stopping the leaks.
It's such a contrast to older journalistic ideals. Like David Halberstam covering Vietnam, he said he was proudest when generals wanted him fired because his reporting angered Washington. Angering power meant he was doing his job. That seems different now. So wrapping this up, where has all this left us? The impact seems undeniable, far bigger than maybe anyone expected. These were irreversible changes.
Definitely. It ignited the first truly global debate about privacy in the digital age. That's huge. And it seriously challenged America's perceived dominance over the internet. People started asking questions.
And domestically, you saw the surprising political alignment. The push to defund the NSA metadata program. That Conyers-Amash bill, it failed, but narrowly. And the support was totally bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats voting together against it. That old red versus blue divide blurred.
Internationally, the ripples were huge, too. The UN General Assembly unanimously affirmed online privacy as a fundamental human right. And Brazil, they canceled a multi-billion-dollar jet contract with Boeing, directly linking it to the NSA spying revelations. Real consequences.
So the way forward, it's probably not about no surveillance, right? The argument is for targeted surveillance based on actual suspicion, real evidence of wrongdoing, not just dragnet collection, and also individuals taking control, using encryption, anonymity tools becoming harder to track.
And Snowden himself. His legacy is partly about breaking the mold. He didn't disappear or get silenced immediately. By identifying himself, by speaking out articulately, he remained a public figure. He showed that speaking truth to power doesn't have to mean your life is destroyed. He wasn't just a leak. He was a person.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener. Snowden was, by all accounts, an ordinary person. Yet through one act of conscience, he fundamentally shifted global conversations and challenged immense power structures. What does that tell us about the potential within any one of us to question the status quo and maybe, just maybe, change the world?